So I'm very happy to share with all of you what I think sign languages can tell us about human language and about the brain. So one thing that sign languages tell us about is the aspects of linguistic structure that are universal to all human languages. So it's really important to include sign languages in the study of human language, and theories that can account for evidence from both signed and spoken languages should be preferred over theories that are speech-specific or sign-specific. Sign languages can also tell us about aspects of language that are influenced by the perceptual systems that are used to comprehend language. So audition compared to vision. So for example, the auditory system is very good at parsing rapid temporal changes on the order of 40 milliseconds. In contrast, the visual system is very good at taking in information simultaneously. And these differences affect the linguistic structure of speech versus sign. So spoken languages or speech tend to have much more linear structure. Sign languages tend to have more simultaneous structure. Sign languages can also tell us about how the nature of the linguistic articulators shape linguistic structure. So sign language production involves two independent articulators that are directly observable. And this difference in biology appears to impact the form of signs. So for example, signs can look like the actions they denote. So for example, the sign for push in ASL. It also seems to affect the nature of spatial language. So how spoken languages and sign languages express the relationship between objects and the location of objects is influenced by the nature of the articulators. And we'll see a little bit about that today. So what I want to ask is, what are the implications of these differences for the neurobiology of language? And the first question I'm going to ask is whether the same key brain regions are involved for sign versus speech production. And we're going to be looking, both comprehension production, we're going to be looking at conjunction analyses using both PET and fMRI data. These are analyses that look at the overlap between speech and sign to look to see whether we see the same brain regions engaged during comprehension and production. Then we're going to turn to contrasts, to differences, looking at direct contrasts between speech and sign, and to see whether or not differences extend beyond just sensory and motor cortices. Then I'm going to turn to some more recent work that we've been doing looking at the electrophysiological responses using ERP data to compare whether we see the same electrophysiological components and modulations that are observed for spoken and for sign languages. So looking at electrical activity in the brain. And then finally, I'm going to end with two specific domains where it looks like we see clear differences between signed and spoken languages. So one difference I mentioned already is how spatial information is encoded. So how you talk about something like the cup is on the table. And the other difference is within the action domain. So signs, unlike words, can resemble the actions they denote. Does that change the neural processes that support these types of verbs? Do we see effects of biology in these two specific domains? Okay, so let's start with production. So this is, again, we're looking at conjunctions, overlap. And the data I'm going to show you is from a sort of meta study with a large number of deaf signers who are naming pictures in ASL, compared with a large group of hearing speakers who are doing the same thing, naming the same pictures in English. And we're going to look to see when they're performing this lexical production task, do we see what regions are the same, what regions are active for both languages. First thing we see is that this Broca's area, left inferior frontal gyrus, or left IFG, was engaged for both spoken word production and ASL sign production. So what this means is the function of this region is not strongly tied to the oral or acoustic phonological features of spoken language. And despite the anatomical proximity of Broca's area to the sensory motor representations of the oral facial articulators, the lips, the tongue, And despite the fact that Broca's area has strong anatomical connections to auditory cortices, nonetheless, this region is involved in lexical production for a visual manual language. So this is not a speech area, it's really a language area. Another region that we saw active for both spoken word and ASL sign production is this left inferior temporal region. And this region has been hypothesized to be involved in conceptually driven lexical access for words and for signs. So the idea here is in a picture naming task, this region mediates between object recognition and lexical retrieval, finding the right word or sign. And we're going to come back to this region at the end of the talk when we talk about spatial language production in ASL. So now let's look at, that was production. Let's look at common regions, the conjunction for comprehension. And I want to point out first the importance of what do we compare. So for sign language, we're comparing signers comprehending ASL sentences or signed sentences. You could compare sign comprehension with visual printed word comprehension. But the problem there is that that's not really a fair comparison in the sense that print is learned late on top of spoken language. We know it to be strongly left lateralized. It's a secondary system. So it's really not the appropriate comparison to try to understand what are the common regions involved in comprehension for signed and spoken languages. You could compare sign comprehension with just auditory comprehension, but really a disembodied voice is not really ecologically valid. It's not the same as seeing a person sign. So really what you want to compare is audiovisual speech, so watching a person talk with watching a person sign. And the two studies that I'm going to tell you about use this technique, comparing audiovisual speech sentences with sign sentences. The task in both of these studies was a sensibility judgment task. So participants were watching sentences, and every once in a while, a strange sentence came up and you had to press a button. And the baseline, in all of these studies I'll be telling you about, you usually have a baseline that subtracts out activation that's not interesting. So in this case, just seeing a person and making a decision. So in this case, the baseline task was you saw the same person still with a colored dot, and you pressed a button when the dot changed color and the dot was on the chin. So you got rid of just visual activation and simple motor responses. Okay. So the top slide you see there is from a study by Mairead McSweeney. She was the first to really recognize the importance of looking at audiovisual speech compared to sign language. This was a group comparison with deaf signers of British Sign Language and hearing English speakers. And so this is the overlap between those two groups. The bottom slide is a within group comparison. So these were hearing native ASL English bilingual, sometimes called CODAs. So they were fluent in both ASL and English. And they did this task in both ASL and then in English. And now we're looking at the overlap. And so one of the things you can see is for both languages, sign and speech, you see bilateral activation in both hemispheres of the brain, but stronger in the left hemisphere and more extensive in the left hemisphere. The other thing you can note is Broca's area, this left inferior frontal gyrus, is engaged for comprehension as well for both languages. So this region is really a key language region for both signed and spoken languages for both comprehension and production. The other important thing you see is this left posterior superior temporal, sometimes called Wernicke's area, was engaged for both sign comprehension and spoken language comprehension. And what's interesting is that this is actually near or within secondary auditory cortices. So again, this is suggesting that this is really language cortex and isn't tied specifically to auditory processing. We see these regions engaged for both sign comprehension and spoken language comprehension. So coming back to my question, are the same key brain regions engaged for signed and spoken languages? Here the answer is definitely yes. We see both Broca's area and Wernicke's area, basically the parasylvian core language cortices are active for both signed and spoken languages. So these are language cortices in the brain that are engaged for both signed and spoken language. We've looked at the conjunctions, the overlap. Now I want to look at differences, at contrasts between spoken and signed languages. And in particular, I want to look at contrasts that are direct, that don't take out a baseline. So when we're not subtracting out perceptual baselines or motor baselines, and we're just looking at a direct contrast between signed and spoken language. Do we see differences that extend beyond just the auditory regions and visual regions? So in this case, we're now looking at bilingual picture naming. So these, again, are these ASL English bilinguals. And they're naming pictures either in ASL or in English. And now what we're going to do, instead of looking at the overlap, we're going to look at the difference. So what's the difference between producing a word and producing a sign? And this is a PET study. So you see this sort of PET palette. And regions that are more purple are more active for English, and regions that are more red are more active for ASL production. And we're going to start with the English comparison. So what you see is not surprising here. You see that for English production, you see activation in auditory cortices much more strongly than for ASL. And this is because the speakers are hearing themselves speak. So when they name, they get auditory feedback from their productions, and this activates auditory regions. For signers, you don't have any, it's silent, you don't have auditory feedback. Some of you may have noticed, kind of surprisingly, there's also more purple, more activation for English production in visual cortices. And I can come back to that in the question times if you're interested. We have an interesting possible explanation for that, but I'm not going to go into that now. Okay. So for sign, what we see when the bilinguals are producing ASL signs, you should see more activation in parietal cortex, in superior and inferior parietal cortex. And this also makes sense because these cortical regions are involved in control of the hand and arms and placements in space, movements in space. And we relatively recently conducted a study to specifically look at the role of parietal cortex in sign production. And I'm going to tell you about to sort of figure out what different regions within parietal cortex might be contributing to sign production. So in this experiment, what signers, this was with deaf native signers in a separate study. And what we asked them to do was translate English words. So they weren't doing a picture naming task, but they were seeing a word and they had to produce the ASL sign for that word. And using that task, we were able to elicit different types of signs. So we elicited what are called body anchored signs. So these are signs that are produced with contact on or near the body, one-handed signs, and then two-handed signs. And the baseline task, the participants saw an English word, but they weren't translating, they weren't producing an ASL sign, but they had to make a decision about whether there was a descender letter like G or P in the word. That was their task. So the first thing we found was that we found much more activation in the superior parietal lobule, or SPL, for body anchored signs, compared to both that baseline task, but also compared to production of the other sign types, one-handed and two-handed signs. And what we suggest is that this activation in SPL represents or reflects the role of that region in controlling hand movements, monitoring the position of the hand in space, and getting the hand to a particular target on the body, which is what has to happen with body anchored signs. So you see more activation for those signs in superior parietal lobule, and particularly because of the way those signs are produced, targeting a location on the body. The other thing we found, I think, that was particularly interesting was when we did a conjunction, that is an overlapping analysis, with all of the sign types. So the body anchored sign, two-handed signs, one-handed signs. You found that the overlap was in the inferior parietal cortex, in particular in what's called SMG, the supramarginal gyrus. And it was much more strong, the overlap was more strong on the left. And what we think is going on here is this is part of this Parasylvian core language region. And our hypothesis is that that region is what's involved in the phonological encoding of signs. And it fits with what we know about spoken languages as well, also activates inferior parietal region, probably in a little bit different exact location and probably stronger for sign language. But it seems to be a region that's involved in the linguistic encoding of the phonology for sign language. Okay. So now moving to comprehension, looking at the differences between sign and speech with respect to comprehension. So this results I'm going to show you are, again, from the bilinguals who are doing the task either in ASL or in English. So they're comprehending signed sentences, the same ones in either ASL or in English, doing that same task of detecting a semantic anomaly. Now we're going to look at regions that are different. So the first, again, is not too surprising. What we see is greater activation for English comprehension in auditory cortices, in superior temporal cortex. So even though we see activation in these regions for sign comprehension, it's stronger and more sustained for spoken language comprehension. And there's lots of evidence from other fMRI studies from ECOG that these regions in superior temporal cortex are involved in phonological encoding for, and in speech decoding for spoken language. For sign, not surprisingly, we see greater activation in temporal occipital cortices. So sign involves much larger articulations that are moving in space compared to the small movements of the mouth. So sign comprehension is engaging motion-sensitive regions as well as what's called extrastriate visual cortex, so higher level visual processing for comprehending sign. And interestingly, we also see activation in frontal and parietal cortices when comprehending sign compared to spoken language. So this, the other interesting thing is the peak coordinates in the SPL and the parietal region were very similar for both comprehension and production. So when we looked at the production regions, these regions were also engaged. So what's interesting about that is that this frontal parietal network has been hypothesized to be part of an action observation network for human actions, and that this dorsal part, that is the frontal parietal network that we see here, see active here, is involved in predicting upcoming actions. So the idea is that there's a predictive coding account of action observation in which this dorsal region, the prefrontal parietal region, generates internal models using production to predict upcoming actions. And within psycholinguistics, there's theories like Pickering and Jared who hypothesize that production and comprehension are intimately integrated systems and both involved extensive use of prediction. So one hypothesis is that what we're seeing in these frontal parietal regions for sign comprehension is use of the production system as a prediction for upcoming signs, for upcoming sign input. So coming back to my question, do neural differences extend beyond sensory and motor cortices? And the answer is yes. We see differences that impact language processing in kind of non-obvious ways. In particular, parietal regions were engaged during sign comprehension, but not speech comprehension. And we think this is a reflection of the nature of the production system. There's other differences that I don't have time to talk about that also relate to this difference between production and comprehension that go beyond just auditory and visual regions. All right. So now, turning away from just looking at basically locations of activation, we're going to look at the electrophysiological responses to signs, in particular to sign comprehension, and look to see what are the similarities and possible differences in the brain response to signs and to words when we look at the electrophysiology. So I'm going to focus on a sort of famous component, the N400 component, which is a negative going brainwave that's elicited by meaningful stimuli. And here we're going to be looking at words. It peaks about 400 milliseconds after stimulus onset. And I'm showing here an example from written words where you see a more negative response to a target that's followed by an unrelated word like bread, target is socks, versus a target preceded by a related word, bread versus butter. Okay, so you see a greater negative response for the more difficult thing, for the unrelated primed word. Okay, now the N400 is related to lexical semantic processing, and the idea is that what you see is more effortful processing will give you a more negative response. On the right, I'm showing you the voltage map, so the distribution across the scalp of where this component or this activation difference is seen in the priming effect. So here it's a pretty wide central, more posterior response. So one thing to know is that the N400 is modulated by the amount of processing, the more elaborate processing that's needed. So one thing that's known is that low frequency items produce a more negative N400, a more negative response than high frequency words. Low frequency words require more processing to activate their representations. You get a larger N400. Interestingly, concrete words also show a larger negativity, a larger N400 compared to abstract words. The idea is that there is sort of a richer, more activation with respect to sensory and motor information that's encoded with concrete words compared to abstract words. One of our questions was also, what about iconicity? So we certainly have low and high frequency signs, concrete versus abstract signs, but in sign languages, there's a lot, there's many iconic signs that allow you to ask whether iconicity affects processing. So do we see iconic signs patterning with frequency effects? So maybe they're easier to process, and so you see a more negative response for non-iconic items, or maybe they're processed more like concrete words, although you can control for that, where you get more rich semantics. So is there even a difference between iconic and non-iconic signs with respect to the electrophysiological responses? But in order to do this type of study, we need information about frequency and iconicity in signs. And this is where the ASL-LEX database comes in, and I just like to advertise this database. It's just been updated to 2,700 signs. Our original ASL-LEX 1.0 had about 1,000 signs. This database is available for you guys to go play with now. The beta version is on there for ASL 2.0. In this database, for all of those signs, each one was rated by at least 25 deaf signers for frequency on a scale of 1 to 7. The nodes in the visualization for this website represent frequency. So the larger the node, the more frequent the item. In addition, we have frequency ratings for, iconicity ratings for all of these signs, all 2,700 signs, from hearing non-signers. So how much does the sign look like what it means? For a subset, we also have ratings from deaf signers. So you can compare hearing ratings, non-signer ratings with deaf signer ratings. And one of the key aspects of this database is the phonological encoding. So the second version has a much more sophisticated coding of the phonological features of signs, and you can search for signs with different phonological features. The visualization shows much more accurate phonological neighborhoods. It's just a great website. So I want to plug it here. So this is the database that we used in our ERP study, where we used a large number of signs that varied in frequency and in iconicity. So in this study, we wanted to look at these different variables, frequency, concreteness, iconicity, and how they affected the neural response during sign comprehension and recognition. And so in this experiment, we had signers, deaf native signers, large group of them, about 40, look or view 400 signs, so a large number of signs. And every once in a while, there was a sign that referred to a person, and that was the target. So their task was to press a button whenever you see a person sign, like boy or mother or doctor, something like that. And we didn't actually analyze those signs. We were mostly just interested in the recognition and comprehension of the signs rather than in the actual response to the signs. So they had to comprehend the signs in order to make the decision. And one last important thing is that we used linear mixed effects analyses, LME analyses, in which we included all of the variables so that you could control for the other variables when you're looking at just frequency or just concreteness. And for the ERP experts who are out there, normally I say in the room, but who are out there watching this, the scout maps that I'm going to show you are not really voltage maps. They're maps of the T values for the LMEs at each electrode. So they sort of reflect the idea of a scout map, but the actual data are the LME statistics. All right, so let me give you just some examples. So we'll first look at high frequency signs. So here's just an example of a sign you might see. Okay. All right. So this is the results from the frequency effects. So on the left, you see the ERP waveforms. On the right, you see the scalp distribution of the effects. One of the things that it's important to note about this is that the responses, so the brain waves that we record, are time locked to video onset. And for spoken languages, really stimulus onset, auditory file onset is the same as word onset. As soon as voicing starts, that's the onset of both the stimulus and the word. For sign, it's different. You have transitions. So when the video starts, the signs then move to the particular position wherever the sign is. So you have about a 400, 500 millisecond transitions from lap positions to the sign onset. So I've marked there where the sign onset is. And what you can see is the frequency effects start right about at sign onset. Okay? And what's parallel for spoken and sign languages is the polarity. That is, we see more negative responses for low frequency than high frequency signs. It's the same as what we see for spoken language. So low frequency words elicit more negativity than high frequency words within this lexical access window. What's a little bit different is the timing and distribution. So in the very early window, at the top there, it's at the frontal sites, anterior electrodes. And then at the later window, it's more posterior. So here's what we think is going on, why we see this a little bit different, different distribution. So psycholinguistic models of frequency often propose that their frequency is represented in different places. In particular, frequency of an item is represented with this phonological form, as well as with this lexical semantic representation. And so our idea is at this early anterior effective frequency is related to the phonological form of sign, the frequency of the phonological form. And the evidence we have for that comes from two studies that looked at priming, phonological priming in ASL. So this is where two signs that look similar. So the example I have here is sushi and nurse. Okay, they have very similar phonological forms. And in one study, the study on the left was an implicit priming study. So participants actually saw English words, but their translations were phonologically related in ASL. And the phonological effect was anterior in this anterior region. So compared, so when you compared phonologically related translations to phonologically unrelated translations, you saw an anterior effect of phonology. The experiment on the right followed that up with explicit priming. So now you're actually looking at the ASL signs and making a semantic relatedness decision. And what you see is an anterior effect of the phonological relatedness compared to when the two signs are unrelated. So this leads us to suspect that phonological processing may be happening or may be reflected in these anterior sites. So this is our hypothesis. We see early form-based frequency effects, and then these later effects are related to the semantic, lexical semantic frequency effects, which has a more typical central distribution for the N400. So it's possible that we're seeing this difference for sign because the articulators and the phonology is so different compared to spoken language. It's possible that the neural generators for the phonological and the lexical frequency effects for spoken language are similar in location and also similar temporally. So they may occur at the same time. So it may not be possible to tease apart those effects with spoken language, but we can see it in sign language. Okay. So let's look at what happens with concreteness. I'm just going to give you some examples of concrete signs and more abstract signs. Okay, just give you an example. Now remember, in these analyses, we're going to be controlling for other features like frequency and iconicity. What we see here is very parallel to what's been found for spoken languages. So on the left, I'm showing you the ERP waves. You can see that more concrete items have a larger negativity than less concrete or more abstract items. You can see that the distribution is central and spread across the scalp. The other thing is you see that this effect is a little bit later than frequency. So it's coming in more when you're getting to the lexical semantic processing, which also makes sense. So what we see here is a very parallel response for concrete words and concrete signs. Okay, so let's now look at iconicity. Start with just some examples of iconic signs and non-iconic signs. Again, in our LME analyses, we're going to be controlling for concreteness and for frequency. And here's what we see. Basically, we do not see effects of iconicity on the windows that are associated with lexical access. So if you look on the left are the ERP waveforms, you see that the low iconic and high iconic signs, those waveforms are on top of each other. There's just not a difference. And when you look at the distribution across the scalp, we don't see differences in timing. So when we control for frequency and concreteness, we don't see an effect of iconicity on lexical access. So we didn't see any modulation of the N400 or neural activity that's associated with lexical access for signs, in contrast to frequency and concreteness. So coming back to my question, do we see an impact of the neurobiology of sign language on electrophysiological responses? And the answer is yes and no. So with frequency, we see the same polarity, so more negative for low frequency signs than high frequency signs. But we saw a distinct distribution. So we saw an earlier anterior effect that we think may be associated with phonological encoding, and a later centro more posterior effect that may be related to lexical semantic access. For concreteness, we saw very similar responses, the same polarity, more negative for concrete signs, and the same scalp distribution, central posterior, strong effect. With iconicity, which is a sort of sign-specific lexical feature, we saw no neural response that was associated with the variability in lexical or in the degree of iconicity for lexical signs. But I should say that we are looking at other aspects of iconicity. Type of iconicity may have an effect. Task may have an effect. So we're still quite interested in exploring whether iconicity has an effect on sign processing. Okay. So now from the last little bit of the talk, I'm going to turn to those two domains I talked about that I've pulled out because they seem to be different for signed and spoken languages. And the first one is spatial language. So talking about the location of objects, the spatial relationship of objects. There's a distinct difference between how signed and spoken languages express spatial information. And this is a domain where the two language groups seem to be pretty different and have a different interface between language and spatial cognition. So here's what I mean by this. So if you look at spoken languages, the vast majority of them, there's languages are complex, but many spoken languages encode spatial relationships using closed class morphemes, using prepositions or locative affixes. So I just have an example here from English where this spatial relationship is encoded with the English preposition on, an example from Italian with sul as the preposition that encodes that relationship. Now for ASL, as well as many sign languages, it's not a closed class morpheme that's encoding the spatial relationship between the cup and the table. It's the location of the hands in space. So you see a hand shape representing the cup, a hand shape representing the flat surface of the table, indicating the spatial relationship. I could also show the cup under or next to or floating above the table, okay? And this is related to the biology of language, right? So I have these articulators that can move in space. The tongue and the lips cannot really be directed simultaneously with an expression to indicate a spatial relationship. They can't be configured in space, okay? So it's a difference in the articulators. And this strategy of expressing spatial locations seems to be fairly universal to sign languages. There are at least no natural sign languages that I'm aware of that use lexical signs or prepositions in typical descriptions of spatial relationships. They use this type of expression, this classifier expression. Now within these expressions, the hand shapes encode the type of object. So I showed you a cylindrical object for the cup. This is showing you a long, thin object and talking about the location of a hammer on a table as opposed to a cup. And spoken languages also have this kind of system where you have a morpheme that encodes the type of object. The example I'm giving you is from a verbal classifier language, Diogenio, where in this example, to cut with a long knife, that little morpheme ah indicates the type of object that's involved in that verb. If you swapped out a different morpheme like to cut, it would mean to cut with a round object or a curved object like a scythe. Okay. So in both spoken and signed languages, classifier morphemes can indicate the type of object. Now there's a lot of controversy within linguistics about whether classifier is the right term, whether these are really parallel. There's plenty of reasons to look at differences between the two. But the basic idea I want to convey here is that the hand shape is indicating the type of object in ASL, and that it's a closed class morpheme. Okay. So my question is, what are the neural consequences of the spatial system that I've just described that we see in sign languages? And so we conducted a PET study to try to get at this. And in this study, our goal was to try to disentangle the production of classifier morphemes and the other aspects of the expression. So location, which I'm going to tell you about, we also looked at movement. So in this experiment, while they were undergoing brain scanning, deaf participants were asked to produce a classifier expression for the location of an object. So here you can see that the hand shape, the object doesn't really change. The figure and ground, the clock and the table are the same, but where the figure object is changes. So you're producing a different locative expression, location expression each time, but the classifiers are the same. Now, one hypothesis might be that these locations are morphemic. They're like prepositions, like above, behind, next to, and you're retrieving those from a lexical representation. Our hypothesis, however, was that these locations really are not morphemic. They're not listable morphemes like prepositions, and they're not retrieved through the language retrieval system. So we contrasted this task where you're just producing location distinctions with a task where you're, again, producing locative classifier expressions, but what's changing is not the location, it's the object that's changing. So you have to retrieve the appropriate classifier morpheme for the object. So you're producing a cylindrical classifier for a bottle, a general object classifier for a lamp, a long thin classifier for a hammer. And we argue that these are listable forms and that you are engaging lexical retrieval mechanisms when you have to produce the classifier handshake morphemes. So what I'm going to show you is the contrast between retrieving locations and retrieving the object classifier expressions. So first, let's look at regions that were more active for expressing location than object type. So what we see, interestingly, is that classifier constructions expressing location engage the superior parietal cortex, SPL, bilaterally. And this activation engagement of these regions makes sense given what I've already told you about SPL, what we know the function of those regions are. So that SPL is involved in motor movements through space. You have to hit a particular target location in space. In addition, this more medial activation in SPL is likely associated with the sort of visual motor transformation that has to happen. So in contrast to spoken language, where you're mapping a spatial relationship onto a closed class morpheme, what you're doing for sign is you have to map a spatial relationship that you observe or imagine onto a body-centered representation in which each hand maps to a particular location. So that visual motor transformation is something that is likely involved in SPL and is unique to the expression of this type of information in a signed language. In contrast, now we're going to look at the other way. So what regions are more active for expressing object type than location? And here what we see are two regions that are more active for this. One is that region in the left inferior temporal cortex that we saw earlier. And again, this region mediates between object recognition and lexical retrieval processes. So we see a very similar kind of activation. The other thing to note is this is unlike the SPL activation for location, which was bilateral. This is the left lateral eye. So I'm not showing you the right hemisphere of the brain because we only see the difference here in the left hemisphere. And of course, the other thing we see is this left inferior frontal gyrus active in lexical retrieval selection processes. So when you have to retrieve a classifier morpheme, you have to pick the right one. And one hypothesis for what this left frontal region is engaged in during production is selecting among alternatives and selecting the correct classifier morpheme for production. Oh, and I should say one other thing is if we asked, when we asked the participants, we had one other task that I'm not showing you the data from, but they were asked to just name the objects. So name lamp or hammer. So they weren't producing a classifier construction, they were just retrieving the lexical name. And what we see is very similar activation. So we see activation in left inferior frontal gyrus and in left IT. So retrieving a lexical sign is very similar, although not identical, to retrieving a classifier morpheme. And that's not the case for retrieving a location expression. Okay. All right, so what is this? What are the implications for the neurobiology of language? One is that for sign languages, there's a different neural computation that has to occur to express a spatial relationship. So spatial representations map onto body-centered reference frames via a visual motor transformation. This is not a computation that has to be done for spoken languages. And I would also say this data suggests that unlike classifier hand shapes, locations in these constructions are not retrieved as morphemes via left hemisphere language regions. Okay, so in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to talk about one last study that looked at another domain where signs are different from words and where iconicity comes into play. So one of the things that's interesting about signs, particularly certain types of verbs, is they can look like pantomimes. They can look like the actions that they denote. So this is a sort of, you can think of it as there's a possible distinct interface between language and human action for sign languages because you have this overlap in form. So the signs that I'm talking about are called handling verbs. So basically the hand shape depicts holding an object and the motion is how the object is used. And I'll just give you 2 examples from ASL of these verb types, scrub and drink. Okay, so those are the verbs we're talking about. If we're thinking about pantomime versus signing, we have to think a little bit about what happens when a person is gesturing, is pantomiming. So the nature of the gesture is determined by the properties of the object that's being manipulated. So if you're pantomiming drinking from a straw or a coffee cup or a shot glass, that's going to look different. Now for the ASL sign drink, it's not determined by the nature of the object, right? The sign drink is specified for a particular phonological representation, hand shape, location, and it's stored in the lexicon. And that verb can be used to, it basically is consume liquid, and you can use that to, regardless of what type of object you're drinking out of. Right? So we want to know what happens in the brain when you ask someone to produce a pantomime versus producing a sign that looks just like a pantomime. Okay. Now I've shown you already the classic language areas that are involved in sign production, but I haven't said anything about regions that are involved in pantomime production. So what we know about pantomime is that what we see is activation. If hearing people are asked to show me how you use a tool, for example, and you compare that with a low-level baseline like just finger movements, what you find is lateralized to the left, you see this left SPL activation for pantomime production. Now, I should tell you that this region is not engaged when hearing people are asked to produce verbs or to name actions, for example. But we see this when they actually have to produce a pantomimic action. Okay, so our hypotheses here were if these handling signs, these pantomimic signs, pattern like pantomime, then we should see greater activation in SPL, okay, because they're engaging these regions that are involved in pantomime motor planning production. On the other hand, if pantomimic signs pattern like spoken words, then we should see activation in left inferior frontal gyrus in Broca's area. We know that when speakers produce words, you see activation in this region. If signs are patterning like words, we should see activation there. All right. So to test these hypotheses, we conducted a PET study. And while participants were undergoing brain scanning, we had them do 3 different tasks that I'm going to go through. I'll explain. One was a verb generation task. Only the deaf signers did this. So we just, they saw a picture of an object and they were just asked to produce a verb that's associated with that picture. For pantomime generation, this was done with both hearing and deaf people. They would just ask, how do you use that object? So basically to pantomime, so pantomime generation. And then the baseline was indicating whether a manipulable object or whether an object could be held or not. And I'll show you an example of that. Okay, so for the verb generation, the signers were asked to produce a verb that's associated with a picture. And we had 2 types of pictures. One picture elicited these handling verbs, and the other set of pictures elicited verbs, but they didn't have this pantomimic quality. Okay, so we could compare pantomimic with non-pantomimic verb production. So here's what these look like. So the object and then the likely verb that would be produced in ASL. So we have write for pen, and then for hammer, the sign hammer. Okay. And these were normed with a separate group of deaf signers to make sure we were going to get these types of productions. This is an example of the verbs that were non-pantomimic that are elicited. So for a ruler, you would see measure. And for syrup, you get this wonderful ASL sign for pour syrup. Okay. Now, for the pantomime generation task, they were just asked to show me how you would use the object. And for those handling pictures, so the pen where you could gesture right, or the hammer, you could gesture hammer, we asked our hearing non-signers to produce pantomimes for those as well, whereas our signers were producing verbs. And then we had a group of pictures that both signers and non-signers produced pantomimes too. So for example, a broom, and so this would be a pantomime of sweeping. And fork, pantomime using a fork. Now it's important to note that the verbs that would be generated in association with these 2 pictures are different. So the ASL verb for sweep looks like this. And then with fork, the verb that was generated was eat. Okay. So we were able to kind of control and make sure that our signers were actually producing pantomimes and not verbs. And then finally, the baseline task, you saw a lot of picture of manipulable objects, just like in the other tasks. And every once in a while, there was an object you couldn't hold. And you just had to gesture for each one. You could hold it or you couldn't hold it with this gesture. The idea here is you get rid of just activation related to seeing objects that are manipulable, motor responses, and thinking about how you hold an object. So we could really just focus in on regions that were engaged in pantomime production and sign production. So here's our results. We see for pantomime production what we would expect with our deaf signers. You see activation in that superior parietal cortex, bilateral but stronger in the left hemisphere. And we saw a similar thing for our hearing non-signers, but the activation was not as extensive. You can see it's much larger in the deaf signers than the hearing non-signers. We didn't quite expect this, but we think it has to do with the nature of the pantomimes that our deaf signers produced, which were really good. They produced more complex pantomimes, often 2-handed. So instead of just showing stir, they would actually show the object. They would often repeat the pantomime and just had crisper hand shapes, clearer. So this may have to do with just more extensive, calling on more extensive sensory motor activation for the pantomimes that the deaf signers were producing. But the key question is what happens with those handling verbs or gestures. So when the signers were producing those handling verbs like write and hammer that looked just like gestures, you didn't see huge SPL, superior parietal activation. What you saw was activation in language regions in left inferior frontal cortex, which is basically what you see in word production and sign production. And when we compare that to our hearing non-signers who are producing pantomimes, You don't see any activation in left IFG language areas. What you see is very similar activation in those superior parietal cortex compared to the other set. Okay. Last, we can now directly compare those handling verbs with the non-pantomimic verbs. If handling verbs activate superior parietal pantomime regions of the brain more, you should see a difference between the two. But in fact, we found no difference between the two. So this is that PET palette again. If we were to see more activation for the handling verbs, you should see red somewhere. And for the other way, you should see purple somewhere, and we don't. Okay? And this actually replicates a different experiment where participants were naming actions. And we found no difference between these handling type verbs and the non-pantomimic verbs, just in naming actions. So the brain is treating these verbs, even though they look like pantomimes, the brain is treating these as signs. So what are the implications of this? Basically, we see that signs activate language regions, so left inferior frontal cortex, lexical search and retrieval regions. Pantomimes activate bilateral superior parietal cortex involved in action planning and motor cortices. And we don't see a difference between iconic pantomimic verbs and non-pantomimic verbs. So I'm going to just end, so I'm running a little over, with just my final take-home messages. Basically, in summary, we see the same key perisylvian regions engaged for sign and spoken languages for production and comprehension. We do see that sensory motor differences can impact language processing in non-obvious ways. So we may see production regions engaged in comprehension that affects different regions for sign compared to spoken language. We see that the neural dynamics of sign and word recognition are similar but not identical. And we see that the biology of language can impact the neural substrates for spatial language, but not for how pantomimic verbs are represented. I'm going to end just with some thanks to our ASL Lex team of collaborators, our neuroimaging team, PET and fMRI, our ERP team. All of these people have been wonderful collaborators. And I also want to acknowledge Cindy O'Grady-Farnaby, who's been involved in all of this work for a very long time and adding her linguistic insights to our work. And there I'll end and turn it over to, I guess, Ronisi. I'm not sure what I should do. Maybe stop sharing?
Yes, please. Stop the sharing, then we can make the questions, follow to the next step. Thank you, Karen. It was wonderful. A lot of work, a lot of results. It's very nice to see this very strong, very consistent work. And we are so glad that you are sharing the summary of all this with us. We have a few questions, actually. I would like to start with a general one and then go to the next few questions that I collected from my colleagues. One would be, do you think the findings about the different status of location and handshake, object handshake, could be extended to the other signs besides classifiers? Then this could have an impact in the linguistic status of these two elements?
Yeah, so that is a really great question. And I think my answer is probably no, it can't be extended in the sense that if you think about, well, yes and no. So in terms of phonology, so the location in phonology, I think is very different. So breaking apart just the location of a sign, so, you know, father in ASL, this particular location, I think that those phonologically specified locations are different, and they probably have different roles, but I think they're going to also have different neural substrates in terms of processing location as part of phonology. Compared to when location is meaningful, and is semantic. So in the case of these classifier constructions where the location is meaningful, that spatial location is giving you semantic information, that's going to be different. And so it's possible that you could maybe extend this into spatial locations for discourse. We haven't looked at that. That is something we're thinking about doing, that it may be that when you have pronominal locations, maybe that patterns like the spatial locations conveying spatial information. They have the same linguistic issues. They're not listable. You can't represent them. So it's possible that that extension might happen.
Yeah, I was thinking about this referential location, spatial location, and maybe we could learn from your research and check if this would impact in terms of the linguistic analysis of these aspects in sign languages.
Yeah, the one difference I'll just add between the references is you usually don't have very many contrasts. So usually in discourse, you might maybe have 3, usually just 2, and plus you use a lot of shift, so you have that happening. So, and I think the spatial descriptions where you're really giving a detailed spatial description, you have lots and lots of contrasts that you have to keep track of. So I suspect that that type of language is going to engage different neural regions than when you're have discourse with pronominal loci.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. There is another question from Immaculada Baez from Spain. Her question is the following: we are not in the habit of making etymologies of the visual, gestual, linguistic signs, but we could not find in pantomime the basis of the evolution of the visual, gestual, linguistic sign. What do you think? What do you see?
So I'm not sure what the question is. Is the question in terms of the evolution?
A comment.
Yeah.
It looks like a comment. Yeah. There is another question. I don't know if you want to comment.
These forms, have gestural roots, and then evolve to become, that's one thing that we're actually kind of interested in looking at with actually hearing language learners, because there's some evidence that when they first learn these types of iconic signs, they're drawing on their gestural knowledge. So there's this wonderful work by Gerardo Ortega. But eventually they have to become lexical signs. And what is that process? How do you go? This is looking, again, this is adults learning these, but it has to move from a representation that's part of a gestural system to part of a linguistic system, and so these are treated as verbs, not gestures. And how does that happen? It's kind of an interesting question.
Yeah, and it's interesting. There is someone else that were asking if you find difference between L1 and L2 signers and speakers. I'm not sure if you have something.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's a great question. So we haven't done that research yet, in part because our first questions, we really just were interested, as you could tell from the talk, what are the parallels and differences between sign and spoken languages? And to answer that, you really have to look at native deaf signers, because they're parallel to hearing native signers of English. So to answer that, you have to look at both. But it's a little bit of a disservice to the deaf community in some ways, because only a small percentage of deaf people are native deaf signers. So if we really want to know how does the deaf brain process sign language, we need to look at a broader group of people. And it's important to look at that variation and understand that variation. So a lot of work from Rachel Mayberry's group has shown that certainly very late language acquisition, first language acquisition, which can happen with deaf individuals, really alters the brain response to language and how it's learned. But there's definitely kind of a continuum, and we want to understand that variation and what causes it. So what are the effects of early language deprivation? If you get is there a difference between someone who is starting to sign it, very early, preschool, compared to 5? I mean, so these kind of questions are really important, and we haven't tackled them yet, although we're thinking about it.
Yeah, actually, this is related to another question that Aline Pizio made, asking about late acquisition. That's the answer, I think.
Yeah.
There is another question from Anderson Almeida. In the cases where the space encodes different grammatical functions, as in the distinction from signs realizing upper and lower areas, that is claimed to encode differences in its specificity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so again, I think this kind of goes back to my answer to the first question. So this difference in specificity, it's possible we can see a neural distinction with regard to that, but I think the linguistic data is more interesting there, showing that that's how space can be used to indicate this type of grammatical information. My sense is that because it's encoding discourse grammatical information, you're likely to see language areas, if you're trying to tease that apart, engaged in that processing. Also, particularly because there's a upper versus lower versus an infinite number of locations that you can use that's going to engage these parietal regions. So that's kind of what I think would happen with that particular linguistic distinction. Is it's not the same as the locations in these classifier expressions.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Just a minute, I will check if there are another questions beside of those. Actually, Immaculada Baez made the question in Spanish now. Let me see if I can work on that. No tenemos la costumbre de hacer etimologías de los signos lingüísticos visogestuales, pero no podríamos encontrar en la pantomima la base de la evolución al signo lingüístico visogestual. She's asking if we could find in the pantomima the evolution for the linguistic information in sign languages relate to visual gestural information.
I mean, I think, yeah, I guess my answer is really, I'm not sure. We know that there are definitely links between sort of gestures, and things that eventually become signs. We know that there are aspects of these types of verbs that are related to grammatical functions, like I'm thinking of Diane Brentari's work on internal versus external agents, and whether you're using an instrument classifier or a handshake classifier. With gestures, it doesn't have that kind of syntactic information, but it may acquire it as it becomes linguistic. So, but I'm not sure if you can trace back, or I'm just not sure of the etymological, analysis, I guess is what I'm saying. So
yeah. Okay, let's see if there is something else. There is a question from Tiago Ramos de Albuquerque. I think he's asking about difference between deaf signers and oral signer, or oral deaf people. If you know something about this, and if in these cases they show different behavior in their brain.
Well, so of course the oral, usually the definition of an oral deaf person is someone who doesn't sign. So, yeah. So
I think this is what he means.
Yeah. So they're in terms of sign processing, of course, they're not going to show activations because they don't understand sign and they can't produce sign. I mean, this isn't quite answering. People have looked at this group in particular to try to look at anatomical changes and some functional changes in auditory cortices that are related to either deafness or sign language exposure. So that group makes out sort of the perfect 2x2, right, analysis to try to understand that. So you have codas who can hear and sign, native deaf signers who can't hear but can sign. You've got hearing people who can hear but don't know sign, and then you have deaf people who can't hear and don't know sign. So with that group of 4 different groups, you can look to see, for example, do you see differences in auditory responses that are related to deafness versus knowing a sign language? And so work by Vila Cardan and the DCL group have been using those groups to tease apart the neuroplasticity, in particular, of auditory cortices. And what you'll see is results that reflect deafness, so responses in auditory cortex that happen to both deaf groups, regardless of whether they know sign language, and responses that are really reflected, particularly in the left hemisphere, that are due to sign language experience. So that's how we have looked at the oral deaf group as in those types of contrasts.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again for your wonderful talk and for answering all these questions and sharing all your research with us in this wonderful summary. We also want to thank you, the sign language interpreters and Portuguese interpreters, Hannah Bier, Fernando Parente, and Sandro Fonseca. They had collaborate with Abralin as voluntaries, and we want to recognize their contribution.
I just want to say to the interpreters, it was really hard because normally you're live and I can look to see, are you done? And to be honest, I didn't realize that until right in the middle. It's like, oh, wait a minute, I need to pause more. So I apologize for not pausing more. it's a consequence, I guess.
Yeah, this whole structure doing online, it's not easy, and we try to manage all the screens and have everybody happy.
Yeah,
it's not easy. Thank you, Karen.
Wonderful.
Okay, do you want to just finish your works and
yeah, I'm very, very pleased to be part of this, and I'm very happy that all of these talks are going to remain online. I'm looking forward to looking at other people's talks that I've missed, so I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.